Our panel this morning is a really extraordinary one, not just because each of these individuals are so accomplished, but they also represent the three ways in which we already articulated how we combat gun violence. Gun violence is a political question. You need to change laws, you need to vote, you need to change people's political behavior and their attitudes. It's a policing question. We need policing and criminal justice strategies that help get guns off our streets and protect the public. And it's also a public education question. We need the public engaged for common sense solutions about gun violence, and we especially need our youth involved in these programs, and we need opportunities for our youth, as was created by Mayor Dinkins in Safe Streets, Safe Cities. So this panel really represents all three aspects of this question, and I'm really looking forward to both their remarks as well as the questions from the audience. Before I quickly introduce our panelists, I just wanted to acknowledge the presence of two members of our city's administration who are here. We have a lot of illustrious people in our audience, but it's our habit to acknowledge those from government. Commissioner Rose Gilhern, Commissioner of the city's Department of Investigation, and Commissioner Edna Handy, Commissioner of the Department of Citywide Administrative Services. Thank you for being with us. I'll begin with Richard Aborn, sitting in the center of our panel. He is the president of the Citizens Crime Commission of New York. Most of you should be familiar with his work. The Citizens Crime Commission, I think, is one of the best advocacy and policy organizations around crime and criminal justice policy in the country today. It's a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization, as I said, focused on criminal justice and public safety policies. And Richard Aborn is an extraordinary leader. He draws from wide experience both as a prosecutor, a litigator, a policy person, and his work in government affairs and management. And in this capacity, he inspires, he cajoles, he, I think, uses every ounce of his intellect and his energy to get the political sector and the public to focus on this very important issue. And he's been, I think, extremely effective in making the changes right here in New York. Before he did this in New York City, he was the president of Handgun Control, now known as the Brady Campaign, as everybody I know is familiar with this organization, and was, of course, in the DA's office in Manhattan, where a lot of people in this field have gotten amazing training. He's lectured at New York University Law School. Sometimes I mention competitors, not too often. But he was also a visiting fellow right here at Columbia University. Please welcome Richard Aborn. And I will just go through all the introductions in this way. We won't have to break up the panel in the same way. As you know, Police Commissioner Ray Kelly was supposed to be here this morning. He was unable to make it, and he sent, I think, an extraordinary replacement. So while we'll miss Ray, we're not going to miss him too much, because he sent Phil Banks III, currently the New York City Police Department Chief of Operations. He was just appointed to this position in March 2013 after serving for 26 years in the New York City Police Department, formerly the Chief of Community Affairs, and he was officially appointed to this highest ranking position from the uniformed officers. And he is the first African American to serve in this position. This is significant both for the city of New York, for the African American community, but also for the nation. All eyes, I don't want to get you nervous, but Chief, all eyes are on you, and we have full faith that you're going to continue the legacy of incredible leadership from the uniformed services in the police department. do the hard work. Your experience, I think, in community relations as well as on the administrative management side, and of course on the beat in the precincts, makes you a uniquely qualified person for this position. Chief Banks holds a Bachelor of Science, degree in Public Administration from Lincoln University. He's a graduate of the Police Management Institute right here at Columbia, and did do some postgraduate work at another one of our competing institutions, the Harvard University Kennedy School. We'll forgive you for that. But we are extremely happy that you could join us this morning. Thank you. And last in our lineup, but of course not least, is my dear friend, John Feinblatt. John is now the Chief Policy Advisor to Mayor Bloomberg, as well as continuing to be his Criminal Justice Coordinator. If you look at titles, you would have no clue about what John really does and how effective his work has been. For our purposes, he is also the person who engineered, strategized, and worked day and night with Mayors Against Illegal Guns, which is the organization Mayor Bloomberg created with several other mayors that now includes 700 mayors across the nation fighting the fight both in Washington as well as around the whole country to get illegal guns off the street. In this context, he's been here in New York also basically making sure that all of the agencies that are involved in criminal justice in New York City actually operate in collaboration. I think that is probably one of the most difficult jobs anybody could give anyone, criminal justice coordinator. You're not dealing with any low-profile individuals who like to take advice from anyone. And the fact is that John has been not just exemplary but extraordinary in making sure that our criminal justice apparatus, this incredible force, works together with each other to create public safety in New York. Before coming to the city, John was the director of the Center for Court Innovation, and I mention that also because this was and is the leading think tank devoted to the problem of solving criminal justice issues, particularly from the perspective of courts. It is a national model, and it's also been very effective. John received his undergraduate degree from Wesleyan University and has a law degree from Catholic University. And for, of course, those policy wonks in our room, he actually does publish articles in referee journals that even academics pay attention to. It's really my pleasure to welcome you here, John. He's come to speak to our students before, and we're very grateful for your leadership and also for your ability and desire to help our students understand what's important about the work you do. Thank you. So the ground rules for our discussion are very simple. I'm going to ask each one of the members of the panel to speak and present their points, and then we will open up for questions. I may have a question or two, but I would prefer that the questions come from all of you. So why don't we begin with our chief.
Good morning. Just as a matter of correction, I'm not the first African-American to hold this particular post. David Scott was the first African-American, and he did a fine job. On the matter of gun safety, and we're going to now change that from gun control to gun safety, in New York City, firearms, they just have this ever-looming effect on us, and it is something that is not going to go away until we as a community, as a people, get serious about the threat that it causes. And one of the things that I like to tell the individuals who work with me, and when I go out to community groups, I like to speak about whenever we have a murder, or whether we have a shooting. And that's why very seldom anyone would ever hear me quote statistics. Because while I'm proud of the fact that in New York City, that the number of murder victims by firearm and the number of shooting victims have steadily decreased over the years, and I'm proud of that particular fact. I'll be very proud when we have a situation where there are no murders or there are no victims. Because when we have a shooting, it not only affects that particular victim, but it protects the person who caused that particular shooting. Oftentimes, it's a young man or young woman of color. So there's two tragedies that's wrapped up in that one number. And then when we add into the fact that the families and the friends and the loved ones who are affected by those particular tragedies, I don't like to categorize it with numbers by being declined. So while we are proud of that particular fact, and I think the city is going in the right direction, something that I ask everyone to look at, if there was a shooting, whether we had one, and it could have been avoided, that's something I think that we need to grapple with. We need to determine how do we make sure that never happened again. And it's very, very simple in my estimation. There was a question that was asked earlier, and the question was, how do you, among your frustration, how do you keep that particular passion? And the way I answer that question, because I do get frustrated, oftentimes it's my wife or my loved ones who hear that frustration on a day-by-day basis, and I share with them, coming into a scene and looking at a young person, or any person for that matter, who's just been shot, going and having to break the news to the family that your loved one is no longer with us, or having to deal with the parent whose child or whose loved one has caused that particular incident. It's not a good feeling. So what keeps me motivated or keeps my courage up is that there's a lot of work that can be done. And when it's done, then you can see and you can believe in the magic, in fact, which we as a community can develop. One thing I would like to say, and I was very much impressed by the president of the Urban League, the former mayor of New Orleans' comments, when he talked about some of the initiatives that he planned in New Orleans and how he brought members from the community forward to implement these initiatives. That was very dear to my heart, because I, for one, don't believe that policing is a police department or it's a police law enforcement responsibility. Policing to me means police and community working together. And I won't point out names, but when I was appointed as the commander of Manhattan North, one of the first conversations that Raymond Kelly said to me when he appointed me as commander was the African American Day Parade. We had a series of violence associated with that particular parade. And he said, quite frankly, I want it stopped. And what I did was, I went out and had a series of meetings with people in the community. And we changed the whole strategy on how we were going to police that particular parade. And there were some people in this room that gave the key components of that particular strategy. And they said, why don't you do this? Or why don't we? And I just want to reemphasize that we try this. And those initiatives and changes that we tried, it was the first time that we can remember that there was not one shooting incident at the African American Day Parade. So it reinforced what I believe, that when we, law enforcement and the community together, come together and say, how do we tackle this particular problem and this particular form of gun violence, I'm very optimistic at what we can achieve.
I'm going to ask John Feinblatt to go next.
Thank you, Esther. This morning, my 7-year-old accused me of taking her drawing paper and asked me what I was doing with it. And I decided what I was doing with it was I was writing down my favorite numbers that have to do with the issue of guns. And perhaps I've been spending too much time around Mike Bloomberg that all I wanted to do was tell the story through numbers. But let me tell you, though. So 85%, one of my favorite numbers. 85% is the number of crime guns that we recover in New York City that come from other states. And that's really why the mayor of New York City is so concerned about this. It's why the mayors of other cities are so concerned about it, and it's why nearly 1,000 mayors have come together. Because what they realize is that as tough as the laws they may have in their state, and certainly we have very tough laws that just got tougher, we are continually victimized by states with weaker laws, and therefore the only way to really fight this effectively is through some sort of federal action. States can help, state laws matter, but in the end, with 85% of our crime guns coming from out of states, you have to have a federal solution. Another of my favorite numbers is 40%. 40% of the gun sales in this country don't have background checks. That's about 6.6 million sales per year. And that means that even though federal law is absolutely clear that if you're a convicted felon or you are dangerously mentally ill or you have an order of protection against you, that you should not, in fact cannot, be authorized to buy a gun without background checks. There's just absolutely no way to enforce that law. So that is one of the major reasons why the discussion that predominated after Newtown was about the issue of background checks. The best way I can think about it is it's as if you went to LaGuardia or Kennedy this morning to get on a plane and there were really two lines, one where people had to go through security and the other where people could just waltz through. Obviously, somebody who wanted to carry something illegal onto a plane would take the other line, even if I think most of us, well, I don't know about Richard, would go through the security line. So
I'd be the first one.
that's why background checks are so important, and that's why the fight over background checks was so critical. I think Mark, who I thought did a great job this morning, asked the question of, well, does it all really matter? And in fact, there's some evidence in fact, strong evidence that yes, it does. So 14 states in this country have actually closed most of the loopholes, New York being one of them, where you have to get a background check, even if you buy from a private seller at a gun show or on the internet or through a classified. And it's fair to ask, well, does it help? So here's three numbers. First is 38%. So in the states that have closed these loopholes, homicides of intimate partners using a gun are 38% lower than in states that haven't closed these loopholes. 49%, what does that mean? Well, in the states that have closed these loopholes, suicides by guns are 49% lower. And if you look at the data, it's not like those people are hanging themselves or asphyxiating themselves. The non-gun suicides are basically even Steven across the states. 17% less aggravated assaults using a gun, including attempted murder, in states that have closed the loopholes. And again, it's not as if the aggravated assaults using different kinds of weapons are so different in the states that haven't. And so with the evidence so strong, with our background check full of holes, with 40% of the sales not having them, do Americans actually care? It's a fair question. Crime is low. The economy is more on their minds. But the data is pretty convincing. 90% of Americans actually believe that we ought to fix the background check system. They don't actually see it as a gun control measure. They see it as just a safety measure, as Mark was talking about. And if you dig deeper into the recent polling, you get some very interesting data. 82% of gun owners believe we ought to fix the background check system. Frank Luntz, a well-known Republican pollster, polled NRA members for us, not so easy to do, and found that 74% said that we ought to fix the background check system. When we did 62 polls around the country since Newtown, we found, again, that this was basically a 90-10 issue. The lowest approval rating we had for fixing background check systems was in Montana, a state obviously with a rich hunting tradition. In that state, 78% of people felt that it was important to close the loopholes in the background check system. So with all of that support, with all of the problems, why did we lose? Good question. I can tell you what many of the senators who voted against us said. They said that it was too much of a burden on legal gun owners and law-abiding gun owners, but it's just not so. About 90% of background checks are done just in minutes. Some of them said, well, it was just too much of a burden because it would be too hard for a private buyer and a private seller to get a background check. They would have to go to a gun store to do it. But in fact, 98.4% of Americans live within 10 miles of a licensed gun dealer. There are in fact 4 times as many licensed gun dealers in this country as there are McDonald's, and 2 times as many licensed gun dealers in this country as there are post offices. So not inconvenient. And finally, they said, well, what this is really about is actually trying to create a gun registry. That's what the supporters of background checks really want to do. Well, except for the fact that the law that was being proposed by 2 NRA A-rated senators, Pat Toomey and Joe Manchin, actually said in the body of the text that any efforts to create a gun registry out of an expanded background check system would be punishable by 15 years in jail. So, don't think those excuses hold up, but we have to go back to why did we only get 55 votes. I think Richard is a veteran of this. He probably has some thoughts about that. I think that there are several issues that just pop into my mind. One is, again, crime is low, so I don't think that there's a sense that this is touching my life, although I do think new towns change that to some extent. I think that one problem we have is that the gun lobby members and their grassroots are really single issue advocates. That's what they come out for. This is the issue that drives them. Many of the people who support more sensible background check systems and other sensible measures, they are fueled by many issues, and so they don't come to this with a sort of verve of a single issue voter. The gun lobby's had the field to itself for a couple of decades now, would you say?
15 years.
Yeah, 15 years. Nobody else has had the megaphone, and our plan is to try to change that. So, thank you.
Richard Aborn, please.
So first, before I start, I want to thank you, Mayor Dinkins, for hosting this and certainly doing it at Columbia. I was a fellow here. I did some work around comparative rates of violence internationally, trying to figure out if the United States was actually a more violent country than other countries. And shock of shocks, found out amongst those states where we could collect data, and that was a challenge. We actually are not a more violent country, except when it comes to deaths by guns. So we really have a single issue that we need to focus on. I also want to thank you because Columbia always feels like a bit of home. My wife did her doctorate here, and she is finishing a book, so she spends her days over at the library. So we got to come up here together this morning, so that was nice. A lot of very, very smart things have been said this morning, and I want to try, if I can, to weave this together a little bit and maybe throw out some questions that perhaps we can discuss, or at least throw out some issues that perhaps we can drill into a little bit. I think the one thing that has already emerged from this morning is that this is a very comprehensive and frankly complex issue. Because if you just drill into any one of the silos that I'm about to talk about, you'll see there are a myriad of questions that can be examined. So let me try and do some of that. So there's been quite a bit of discussion around what I'll call the policy area. And why is that important? I no longer talk about just policy. I now talk about policy and communications. Why do we say that? Because frankly, a great policy idea is nothing more than a great idea if it's not amply communicated. It is critical in this age to understand the tools to communicate, and they are many and they are growing by the day. But if you don't understand that, frankly, you're like the proverbial tree falling in the forest when no one is there. So I really urge policy students to really think about the communication side of this. Now, how have we practiced that? Mayor, I don't know if you'll remember this, and Congressman, I don't know if you'll remember this, but the march towards our successful passage of the ban on assault weapons actually started in Barbara Fife's office when she was in City Hall, when you were still in public housing, which was a great time. We had a conversation. She was then deputy mayor. I brought a police officer in and Larry Lowenstein in, and we had a talk about the need for the city council and for the mayor to get behind what was then, we were starting to call them assault weapons, a term we had recently come up with. And Barbara immediately embraced it, and Mayor, it took you about half a second to say yes. When can we get it done? And then there was a press conference, which got an enormous amount of attention, and we then passed the bill here in New York, and we were one of the first cities to do so. Now, my people kept saying to me, why do you go to New York to do this? Well, the reason was what John just said. The bullhorn's here. The bullhorn's here. You want to launch a public policy debate in this country? Do it in New York. You want to experiment around public policy? Do it in New York. The town is open to it, and what people do here matters because others watch. That then went to, and I think you'll remember this, we then did a press conference, and this is the political piece, with then Governor Clinton, who had recently become the nominee, and Congressman Rangel, you were there, on the steps of City Hall with Jim and Sarah Brady, in which we arranged for a phone call to be made by the mayor to then Governor Clinton, who we strategically put in Texas, not exactly friendly country, so that he could then endorse the Brady bill and the ban on assault weapons. And you were both incredibly elegant there, incredibly eloquent, and those words got picked up. So the point is, if you're thinking about public policy, you've got to think about the tools that are out there that will communicate that idea, and I think that's something we need to talk about in the political context here this morning. The other piece of the policy question, which John has begun to get into, is to be constantly asking ourselves, are the policies that we are advocating likely to work? And then once we do pass them, are they working? It is our responsibility to make sure that the things that we successfully pass actually work. Why? There are two reasons. One, it makes no sense to put good tax dollars into bad programs. It simply makes no sense. If something's not working, walk away from it. It's not a big deal. It happens. But secondly, the best advocacy tool out there is to show that something is working. You want to get a legislative body behind you? Show that something is working. So it's incredibly effective to be always asking yourself that question. This issue also operates on the legal level. The mayor Morale, began talking about the product liabilities cases that we filed back in the 90s. But there's also this entire question, which we should discuss at some point, around what is rapidly becoming the seminal case of DC versus Heller. What does the Second Amendment mean in the modern political context and in the modern legal context? There's a lot of jurisprudence beginning to develop around Heller. It's a critically important conversation. And frankly, if you're going to be involved in this work, you need to understand that case, because I tell you, and John just highlighted it, I don't know if he did it on purpose, but he just highlighted it 4 times. Our opponents in this are not beyond, shall we say, misrepresenting some of the things that are out there. So if you're not armed with the facts, forget it. You will be overwhelmed with the rhetoric. This issue also exists on the cultural level, a very difficult conversation. But we need to understand what indices of violence are out there and how we can begin as a society, not legally, meaning not with legislation, not with litigation, but as parents, as teachers, as educators, as leaders, as members of our community, can start to tamper down some of the cultural violence that's out there. And we can do that. People always say to me, oh, you can't do that. Nonsense. We can do that. We can do that. And then finally, of course, it exists on the political level. Excuse me, I forgot one thing, one of the most important. It exists on the area of law enforcement. This city is very blessed to have, I think, probably the most effective police department in the country. To be sure, there are issues. But there have been so many successes by this department year after year after year that it is truly miraculous. It's unbelievable what a safe city this is. And then finally, it does exist on the political level. If this were a conference about controlling environmental pollutants, we would not be talking about doing this on a state-by-state basis. We simply wouldn't do it. It'd be ridiculous. It's the same thing with guns. Guns travel freely amongst the states, whether they're legal or they're illegal. So we really do have to understand why it is when 85 or 90% of the American people support a proposition, the other side can get away with stopping Congress from doing that. So let me try and give you what may seem to you at first a vague answer and perhaps a bit controversial, and then we can really talk about this. Mayor Morale talked a lot about courage. And up until now, it has actually taken courage for a lot of politicians to vote for this bill. But there's something wrong with that. There's something wrong with that equation. There's something wrong with an equation which says when 30,000 Americans are dying every year, more Americans die every year than all the soldiers killed in Iraq and Afghanistan from the beginning. When that number of people die, and 90% of the American people support this proposition, it should not take courage to vote for that. So there's a failure going on out there, and we need to discuss that. But to be just really blunt about this, until we convert voting for a piece of gun reform or gun safety, call it whatever you want, from an act of political courage into an act of political necessity, we will have not won. That's our challenge, accomplishing that conversion. Thank you.
I want to thank our panelists and open up the floor to questions. While we're getting those mics to those of you who have questions, please raise your hand so you can get the mic. I have one question for the entire panel. This is sort of, I hope, will go to the heart of your jobs and the work that you do and the effectiveness of it. It's very clear that in every aspect of this issue, we need the public's involvement, we need the public's engagement. So from the perspective of your position, and I know I hate when people ask me this kind of question, but I'm going to do it to you. What is the one thing that you would like to see the public doing in order to support your work? So just one thing, and that will give those of you who have questions an opportunity to sort of get queued up with the roving microphone. And I hope you have a second to think about that, and we'll start with John Feinblatt.
Well, recess is coming up for Congress, and if you have friends or feel like spending some time in states like Arkansas or Nevada or Arizona or Georgia or even Alaska or North Dakota or New Hampshire, I'm probably missing a few, it would be a very good time to hold senators in those states accountable.
That sounds good to me. Richard?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think the second piece is if you know or are a gun owner who abides by the law and understands the distinction between reforming our gun laws and a gun ban, meaning we're not seeking a gun ban, we really want to keep guns away from criminals and from those with mental health issues that indicate they shouldn't have a gun, get those gun owners to speak out. That's beginning to happen, and that is as important as when law enforcement came into debate. Get those gun owners to speak out and call those members of Congress in those jurisdictions that John mentioned. That can make a huge difference.
Well,
Chief Banks.
Well, I think John Feinblatt stole what I was going to say, so I won't echo that, but that would have been my number one answer. So now I would say establish an intimate relationship with your precinct commanding officer and have him or her, which is very simple to do, have him or her keep you abreast of the issues as it relates to the gun problem, not only in the city, but specifically in the area in which you live.
Okay, our first questioner is Congressman Charles Rangel.
While I was trying to seek recognition, I missed John's answer, but I assume from those who followed, it was to get active in agitating your elected officials. We only have 100 senators, and I assume everyone knows that we like to think in the House that is where the people govern, because there's 435 of us, and you get to us a lot quicker and faster every 2 years than you can to a 6-year person. What has happened also is that reapportionment has solidified our district so that incumbents have such an advantage that instead of worrying about who is going to defeat you in the general election, most of the fears is, are you to the left of the Democratic Party far enough so that you're not challenged? Or are you to the right of the Republican Party so you're not challenged? But most is that you are secured if you follow the part of your party that can defeat you in a primary, even though you can't be defeated. Having said all of that, anytime you find a situation where 90% of the people want one thing, and you find that the Congress is going in another direction, there's something wrong if you think that the American people care enough at press conferences but don't care enough to really let people know that they are prepared to follow through. Many people whose constituents overwhelmingly want background checks, overwhelmingly support controlling gun violence, overwhelmingly wants the Congress to come together instead of fighting each other, overwhelmingly supports women's rights and immigration. The organizations that are against it are organized, and the people are not. At my age, I'm afraid of offending any religious leaders, but everything we're talking about is moral. We're talking about the taking of human lives that's been created by God. And the church is concerned with same-sex marriage and a variety of other things that they think are important, but Americans are not mad enough to grab representatives, call them up, and say they will remember. The NRA remembers. Right causes remember. Left causes remember in primaries. But why Americans are so indifferent, including our business people, as we find the resources of America being sucked up in crime and jails and unnecessary wars and budget fights that we're losing our international competition. So what I'm saying is that it may be that there are elections, but very, very few incumbents are in jeopardy of losing their seats.
Could you all comment on this issue of how you create political influence for the public when, as the congressman pointed out, most of the fights are during primaries for safe seats? John, you want to start?
Well, Congressman Rangel's analysis is extraordinarily, it is the analysis. I mean, what we found in this fight was, which was so difficult, was that this was really about primary elections. And when you looked at the Republicans who should have voted for this, who had huge support in their states, who had influentials trying to influence them, the one thing we couldn't assure them of was that there wouldn't be a primary candidate to the right of them that would use this issue to hurt them. And that was, I think, the major political challenge that we faced. Interestingly, when you looked at somebody like Toomey and questioned why would an NRA A-rated senator from Pennsylvania actually come onto this bill, it was because he's not going to be challenged on the right. What his big problem was that he sort of shouldn't be the senator from Pennsylvania in the first place, and he knew that he had to moderate, I think you'd agree with me, his stance, and that this was helpful to him. And in fact, in all the polling since, you see that his polls have actually gone up. They're higher than, in fact, they've ever been since the vote. But we have to mobilize and figure out what to do with this, given the fact that the map looks the way it is, and it's a tough issue.
Richard, I'm not going to ask our chief of police to respond to a political question,
I was gonna
because
speak
I
for
am
him,
a
so
gracious person who understands that you don't do that.
Let me pick up on John's answer and be a little more granular. So Congressman Rangel is exactly right. And as I said before, this is a political fight, so you have to treat it like a political candidacy. Your candidate is your piece of legislation. So we faced this exact same issue, as you'll recall, in the 90s when we first did Brady and the ban on assault weapons and the ban on large volume clips. Nobody wanted to touch us. So the political fight, and actually more so now than in the past, but even in the past, usually operates on two levels. There's the financial side of it, and then there's the voter intensity side of it, which is what the congressman is referring to. How do you match the voter intensity of the NRA members? Now, what do I mean by that? The NRA members turn out, they vote, they show up at town hall meetings, they call radio shows, they write letters to the editor. There's almost this Zen-like quality in these NRA members because they are organized around this single issue, and that's very important. The NRA has argued to its members that we're out to take away everybody's guns. You want to get somebody involved in a political effort, threaten to take away something they have, or offer to give them something they don't have. Simple as that. So what we had to do, and this is in the age before the internet when the NRA was outspending us, I think 30 to 1 or some ridiculous number, is we went to those districts and we organized on the ground. We identified what we called our influentials, the newspaper folks that were supportive, the local business people who were supportive, the church leaders who were so critical to this, and our activists. And we created little micro political campaigns in those communities, organized using all the traditional organizing techniques, and I think you have to do that again. The mayor's efforts, and this has been led by John, has done a phenomenal job of putting this issue back on the map. We now have money coming in a way that we've never had before. We have an internet presence in a way we've never had before. Now if we just get that ground war going, get organized in the local districts, this issue will be irresistible.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Carl Weisbrod has a question, a former president of our Economic Development Corporation and advisor during the Mayor Dinkins administration. Please ask your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. This is really a question, I think, to both John and Richard. I doubt if, I'd be really surprised if there's a person in this room who doesn't support stronger gun legislation, whether it's gun safety or gun control, and all of the measures that you're talking about. However, one of the responses I hear from senators who voted against the Manchin-Toomey amendment is that the current gun laws, weak as they are not being enforced. National gun laws are not being enforced. That the president's budget, the budget that just was released, has a pathetic $15 million in it for gun control, that requests on background checks that are made by gun dealers are not followed up, that there's a long delay. To what extent, to your point, Richard Aborn, that the facts presented by the NRA and others are often false and misleading, are those facts false and misleading, and to what extent does this administration and prior administrations bear some responsibility for not enforcing what we have on the books already, weak as it is?
Carl, there's no question about it that the Department of Justice and ATF are not doing a very good job of this, and I think it does weaken our position. When you look at the number of people who were turned down as a result of a background check system, and then look at the percent of those who actually were prosecuted by the Department of Justice, it's in the single digits in percents, and that's a mistake. There are lots of things the Department of Justice could be doing, both about inspecting rogue gun dealers, doing it on a schedule that made sense, prosecuting people who try to buy guns that shouldn't. And it certainly, I think, was a talking point for the NRA, and it was a talking point for senators. Why you draw the conclusion that if they're not doing that, you shouldn't do this is the one I've never been able to really map, and it doesn't make sense. The truth is, yes, DOJ has to be doing more. The White House has to be putting more money into the background check system. ATF has to be inspecting dealers more than they are. All true, but that doesn't lead me to the conclusion that therefore you shouldn't expand the background check system, but an absolute good talking point that we essentially gave the gun lobby.
But let me tell you what they didn't tell you. So what they didn't tell you is that they have exercised all their political clout to try and block the White House from naming a permanent director for ATF. They have exercised all of their political clout to do whatever they can to both defang and defund ATF. They have successfully prohibited the national government from researching gun violence. You have no research funds out there. You could go on and on and on. So they give you the little bits that they want. Unfortunately, we were fighting on so many fronts, I don't think we pushed back quite hard enough on this front, and it did give them a talking point. One of the most interesting things that's going on out there, actually there are two, which are somewhat, well, one's nascent, one's not. The nascent one is that a number of states, particularly along the eastern seaboard, are beginning to link the back end of their fusion centers so they can pick up gun trafficking information intelligence and begin sharing it amongst the states. That's an interesting experiment that's going on out there now, and that may actually reap a large number of rewards. And the chief will tell you that there are a number of cities, I actually don't know how many, where there are joint ATF local, or in our case, joint ATF NYPD task force out there buying guns in bulk, trying to understand the trafficking pattern. So there's a lot going on that wasn't talked about, but we did end up ceding that point to them because they hit the highlights without telling the full story.
Thank you.
Is that there are only 3,000 inspectors with the Alcohol, Firearm, and Tobacco Agency because the National Rifle Associates, they work each and every day. They have been putting restrictions on the AFT in addition to cutting back the resources. And so we have 300 million guns and 3,000 agents, which I hope will be corrected because I do truly believe that the gun weapons bill will be coming back to the Congress.
Okay, we have 3 more questions and not any more time. So I'm going to ask the three folks just to ask their questions and give the panelists an opportunity to answer all 3. I have Professor Christina Greer, Joyce Pernick, and a gentleman in the back. So get the mics over there in that order. Let's start with Professor Greer.
Hi. It seems like we're having an aerial conversation about gun control, and I love Mark Merrill's concept of gun safety. But I wanted to bring the concept of law enforcement more directly into the conversation, and the title, which is Safe Streets and Safe Cities. So when we talk to men of color, especially youth of color, many of their arguments for owning guns, legal and illegal, is that they also fear the police department and sort of what some would consider an excessive use of force in particular communities. So can you all speak to the fact that many individuals of color, young and old, actually feel as though they need to protect themselves from the cops and the robbers?
Okay, I guess we're going to let you answer that question, but could we hold off? I just want to hear all 3 questions because we already lost one panelist, and I want to make sure we have the both of you here for these 3 questions, and then you'll get the first chance, of course.
Okay, so this is a political question. I am still not clear, excuse me, on the political solution when you're dealing with gerrymandered districts in the Congress, with members of Congress who are coming from districts where, while 90% of people in the country support background checks, not in those districts, and where the definition of courage would be, as somebody mentioned a few minutes ago, to be challenged from the right and to lose his or her seat. I don't know any politician who's going to say, hi, I'm leaving, just to make a point. I have never seen anyone like that. So willing to forsake his or her seat, it's just not what politics is. So I haven't heard a solution to the real problem, which is these gerrymandered districts and, in some cases, very conservative states, where you would have to sacrifice your career in order to show the kind of courage you're talking about.
Thank you. And we'll do the last question.
Yeah, I'd just like to ask your opinion. Perhaps the chief is not going to weigh in on this. The question of the Democratic Party in the Senate. That is that there were several senators, Balkis, senators from Montana, Alaska, and others in Arkansas, who voted with the Republican majority. And many talk about the fact that the reason the vote came out the way it was simply because the Senate, the Democratic Party didn't want to lose control, or doesn't want to lose control of the Senate. And that will be the way it is forever with these kind of bills. I wanted you to comment on that.
Okay, I'm going to ask the chief to address the policing and criminal justice questions, and of course I'll ask Richard to address the political questions.
I'm not sure if I heard your question correctly. You said that you've spoken to, or many polls or have indicated that young men are carrying guns because they're afraid of the police, so the gun is to protect themselves against the police? I'm not sure if I heard that question correctly.
Right, so anecdotally, we know that in cities, because of, say, what some would argue egregious stop and frisk laws, when you ask young people, why do you need to carry a gun? Why do you feel as though you need to protect yourself in your own neighborhood? They oftentimes argue it's not just someone from a rival neighborhood or another drug dealer, whoever it may be. They also fear the police departments in their respective cities.
So that's the reason why they're carrying the weapons, because they fear the police department.
Yes, because it's weapons beget weapons.
Well, I've never particularly heard that, and I would just say to a young individual or the person who's mentoring or bringing up that young individual, I've never heard that I'm carrying a weapon because I'm afraid I'm going to use it against the police department. I think that if you hear a question like that, that's someone who's certainly him or her is misguided and certainly needs some type of some mentorship in their particular life. What I will say is that there are various reasons why young men and women carry weapons in inner cities. Now, specifically talk about New York Cities. I don't know one of them that is a legitimate reason to carry them. And I'm not even talking about young men and women, because we see many older ones who have weapons who are not licensed to have them, are not trained to have them. Subsequently, we see a very high accident rate. So I can't give one legitimate reason why someone who is not trained and licensed to carry a weapon in New York City or these inner city neighborhoods should have them. I've spoken to, and I would argue that I've probably spoken to as many young adults in this city as much as anybody. I've never heard that particular ever. And I'm not talking about reading polls. I'm talking about me dealing with the children, the vast majority of the young teens that I have dealt with. I've never heard that ever, that I'm carrying the guns because I want to protect myself against, quote unquote, the police officers. I've heard because I'm fearful that I'm going to be a victim of a robbery. I'm fearful that I'm going to be a victim of a rival crew or gang particular member. I've heard those. What you're saying is the first time that I'm aware of that. Guns are no good, and that's particularly the bottom line. And we stress to people who have the right to carry guns the need for you to have training safety, because we see and we study that people who we license to have handguns, that if you don't stay abreast of that, and here's one simple solution. We tell individuals who get licensed that you have children. So some people put the weapon to the point in which their children can't reach. But children get older and they grow, and they're into that same world. The child can't reach there. Well, 3 years of age, the child can't reach it, but now your child is 13 years of age. So there's not only a legal issue, there's a safety and training particular issue. Guns are no good, and we cannot press a button to rewind. So I would tell any young man or young woman who gave me that particular answer there that they're probably in need of some type of mentorship, because that path that they've chosen is only going to take them down a path of destruction. It's something that's not going to be, it's not going to be beneficial at all.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Richard to respond to the last two questions, and then I'm going to call on Mayor Dinkins to close out our forum with the final remarks from Congressman Rangel.
So the political question is, I think, answered as follows. First of all, Joyce, I know you know this, but to state the obvious, you don't need to get everybody. You only need to get a majority in the House, and because of the filibuster rule in the Senate, slightly more than the majority. So you do an enormous amount of targeting. So when I was running the national movement, literally every single day, I would get a report on every single member of Congress rated A through D or E, telling us where that member of Congress stood on our legislation from our Hill staff, and I was in frequent contact with the Hill, with the White House, and with Justice, comparing our notes, and from that list, and this happened every day, we would then target certain members of Congress. So we knew all our A's were with us, we knew our B's were probably leaning towards us, so we had to work on our C's, and the effort, and with those C's, we knew we could win the piece of legislation. And when I talked about this targeted activity before, that's what we did. We honed in on those districts. We're not going to try and convince the country. We're going to try and win in those districts. So we mounted very aggressive ground games. We had organizers out in the field who would go into those districts, spend a long time organizing those districts, working with newspaper editors, working with all the press corps, et cetera, all the people that had influence in those communities, and then organize grassroots groups. The American people want this legislation. But very often, The movement has to show people how to organize and direct that, because people don't innately know how to do this. So there are very specific tools one uses. So I'm actually not as worried about, I understand the gerrymandering problem, I completely understand that. I also know there are certain members we're never getting, no matter what we do. But there is that group in the middle that we're convinced if we bring them along, we get them. But we have got to organize, organize, organize. We've got to match what we call the warm bodies that the NRA puts out there with our own warm bodies. So when Congressman Rangel gets to work, I mean, he's completely supportive, but if he wasn't, he's getting 100 phone calls, not an email, a phone call saying, hey, why aren't you voting for this bill? So I think it's sort of, I think it's both questions are the same.
Yeah.
That's what it is. This is an organizing challenge.
Thank you. Thanks to this wonderful panel, Richard Aborn, John Feinblatt, and to Chief Philip Banks. We really appreciate it. As Mayor Dinkins makes his way up to the podium, I just want to make a brief announcement, a congratulatory announcement to our acting dean, Robert Lieberman, who's just been appointed provost at Johns Hopkins University. We will be sad that you're leaving, but so happy for this recognition and incredible appointment.
Well, Dr. Fuchs, thanks again for not only this particular forum, but for all the others in which you've assisted us. I just want to thank everybody for coming, particularly our panelists. I still say that Chief Banks is awful young looking to be a chief of the department. And you're gonna hear from my brother, Congressman Rangel, in just a second. He will close us out, send us on our way. But I'm so pleased that so many of you are here. I'm particularly happy to see some of our students, because these are the folks who are really gonna change things for the future anyhow, not only in this city, but around the world. And I'm grateful that you are here. You know you got an A, just by showing up. So I'm pleased, I'm happy that the Fourth Estate is with us. That is important, because as has been said, it's necessary not only to have these great ideas, but to communicate them. You gotta get the word out. And anybody, when I read that the children in Newtown had been, everyone had been shot more than once, I mean, that just reading that, I mean, no photographs, no nothing, just reading that got to me, and I'm not the only one that loves children. How can anyone not be moved by that? So let's have my brother come and close us and send us forth. And by the way, my bride did get here. My bride is here in the back. Send us home.
Well, I guess some of you heard that there was a guy named Mark Udall, and when I first got to the Congress, there was a boring, long debate. It lasted until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and we thought everyone had spoken, and Udall was recognized. He went to the well of the House, and he said what we thought was the end of the debate. He says, everything that has to be said and should be said on this subject has already been said. And as the House exploded in applause, he added, but not everyone has said it, to our dismays. Well, I won't put the other part there, because the lady that asked the question, with reapportionment, with primaries, how can we really have our voices heard? And Richard gave the answer once, he gave the answer twice, and he gave it 3 times. I want you to know, I can hardly think of anything that a politician will not vote for if it means his reelection. It is sad, it is true, and if you can't understand that, then the whole system about the People's House and the Senate, then forget the whole thing. But if you do believe that, you have to accept the fact that most people don't vote, most people are not registered, most people don't participate. those people who are voting as registered as an independent are basically saying, I only get involved in primaries. I don't vote for Democrats or Republicans in the primaries because I cannot. And many people don't have a choice when it comes to the general election because they didn't participate in the primaries. The second thing is that there's no question in my mind, as the mayor talks about children being shot multiple times, assault weapons that are only designed by gun manufacturers for sale to destroy human beings because there's no satisfaction for real hunters to be using these things. Background checks, which anything that makes this much common sense, in my opinion, ministers, priests, rabbis should be taking this as a moral issue if indeed before that Senate vote, the religious community in every synagogue, in every church, in every temple had told them this was their time to exercise not only their political power, but a moral thing where they can say that they did this much to save a child or an innocent person. I'm not talking about supporting illegal wars and immoral wars. No, that may be asking too much. But something where you got overwhelming support, you have to do it the way Richard said. One, you don't think it's going to happen on a national level. Two, you don't need everybody in the House and Senate. And three, if you concentrate and let people know that the community has their back on this issue, no amount of money from the NRA, no amount of influence and endorsement from the NRA can ever compete against the wrath of people in their district that are telling you, your family, and your friends to do the right thing. David said, get up, say what you have to say, and get the heck out of the way. Thank you, David. Thank you so much for the work that you continue to do. Your service in the mayor's office may have come to a standstill, but your service to your city and your country continues.